Okay, we are back and we're going to finish this very quickly. I was talking about the Treaty of Paris. The British and the American colonists and several of the Native American tribes have defeated the French and had defeated some of the Native Americans, and there were some very important things that came as a result of this war. And so the Treaty of Paris was something that was an agreement that they both decided on in order to end the war. So, the Treaty of Paris was the formal agreement ending the French and Indian War. It was signed on February 10, 1763. Now, it's very confusing. They weren't very creative when they came up with the treaty names. So, obviously, the Treaty of Paris was signed in Paris. And so we need to remember this, the Treaty of Paris of 1763, because the treaty that ended the American Revolution was also called the Treaty of Paris, but it was signed in 1783. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763 ended the French and Indian War. Representatives from Britain, France, and Spain met in Paris. Met in Paris, France to sign the treaty. Okay. The treaty ensured peace between the countries and punishment for the losers of the war, France and Spain. France was forced to give up most of its land in North America as a result of losing the war. Okay, so basically, all of that land, the Ohio River Valley, okay, all of that land was now belonging to the British government, which was extremely important because now the American colonists, they thought, woohoo, we won the war. We're going to get to go over the Appalachian Mountains and we're going to get to settle the Ohio River Valley. That's not what happened. And we're going to talk about that right next. All right, so France was forced to give up most of its land. Spain was forced to give up its land in Spanish Florida. All right. This next thing we're going to talk about is called the Proclamation of 1763. All right. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763 was the treaty that ended the French and Indian War. After the British were the victors, woohoo, they decided King George III, okay, he was a little crazy. King George III decided to make a proclamation of 1763. A proclamation is different than a treaty because the treaty was between the two countries to end the war. A proclamation was given by King George III as, this is what's happening, this is kind of what I want, you need to follow it. So, after the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, King George III of Britain made a proclamation or announcement to his subjects living in the 13 colonies called the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 told the colonists that they could not settle or move to the land that lay to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. King George thought that this land should be left for the Native American tribes that were already living there. King George also thought that the decree would keep colonists and Native Americans from fighting. All right. And we're going to go ahead. Okay, this angered the colonists who thought that they had earned the right to settle this land by fighting in and winning the French and Indian War. So here, the French and Indian War, the British and the American colonists, okay, fought a lot of the war themselves because there wasn't a big British troops presence in the American colonies at the time. And so a lot of the fighting happened because the American colonists did it. And so now you're telling these men, okay, that fought in the war, these men who possibly lost sons in the war, or they, their wives and their children were attacked by Indians and stuff, they won this war and they thought, okay, this was worth fighting for. We're going to get to be able to better our lives. We're going to move to new land. We're going to settle it. We're going to farm it. We're going to make something of ourselves. And then King George III comes along and says, not so fast. You're not going to get to do that. That would have made me angry. So many colonists were so angry about the proclamation that they disobeyed King George III and started settling the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains anyway. More colonists moving west meant that more and more Native Americans were being pushed off their lands. This caused many fights between the Native Americans and colonists. So King George has said to the Native Americans, okay, he made this promise when some of the tribes signed up to fight with the British. They said, okay, if we win the war, then we'll let you keep your lands and stuff like that. Well, the American colonists were basically kind of told that, okay, we're fighting for this Ohio River Valley so that we can settle it. So now the war is over, and he's made kind of promises to both sides, and he chose to side with the Native Americans rather than his own British subjects, because at this time they're still British citizens, and he chose the Native Americans over the British citizens. All right. What was the Sugar Act? We're going to talk, this will be something that will be one, when we talk about causes of the Revolutionary War, we're going to talk about the Proclamation of 1763. The British they had major debt. Okay, debt is money owed. They owed major money. Okay, they used a lot of money fighting the French and Indian War. And so they had to come up with that money somehow. And so what they did is they passed taxes, one of them being the Sugar Act. Next one was the Stamp Act. We got Townshend Acts. We're going to go into all of those acts. But what happened was they thought, okay, we're going to tax those American colonists, okay, to make up for all of the money that we kind of spent on this. Well, wait a minute. You just told the American colonists, you know what, you fought in this war, but you can't settle this new land. So now they're telling the American colonists, you can't settle this new land, and you're going to have to pay for the war that we just fought by paying taxes. This was not a happy time in the British colonies, the 13 colonies, and so this all started to brew and brew and brew and brew and brew, and then we finally have the beginnings of the American Revolution. We're a little bit away from that. We're going to go through the causes more, but let's talk about the Sugar Act for a minute. While the British had won the French and Indian War, they had racked up a hefty debt in that process. Debt is money owed. The Parliament, our lawmaking assembly of Britain, okay, so it's kind of like our Congress is right now. It's just in Britain, they're called the Parliament, all right? Parliament decided that new taxes needed to be collected in order to repay their war debt. Parliament decided that the British colonists living in the 13 colonies needed to help pay back the cost of the French and Indian War. Now, one of the rights under British law is that basically all British citizens are treated equally. And so at this time, British was a huge, huge empire. They had colonies all over the world. Well, they didn't charge any of those other colonies taxes to help pay for the war, only the American colonists. And that did not set well with those American colonists. All right. And they call them British colonists. I'll call them American colonists because they're in the Americas. But you got to remember, when we call them colonists, they are still British citizens. Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764. The Sugar Act taxed sugar and molasses that were imported by the colonies from the plantations in the West Indies. Colonists were not happy with Parliament and felt that it was an unfair tax. All right, that's where we're going to end with this. Now, you have a second page that you need to look at, and it says, get ready for a review. All right, this is going to be one of those things where I'm just going to go through, read the questions. You put down the answer that you think is best, and we're going to see how it goes. If you want to stop and go back to the videos and look and see if you can't find it, if you want to remember it, or if you just want to put it down, that's totally up to you. Okay, so it says, when did the French and Indian War begin? 1754, 1762, 1776, or 1750? All right. The next one is, oh, well, wait a minute. Is it going to give you the answer? Nope, I'm not going to show you the answer, so I'm going to skip to the next question. All right. Which is not another name for the French and Indian War? So not. So that means if they give me 3 choices, that means 2 of them are going to be and 1 is not. They want to know the one that is not. The War of Conquest, the Revolutionary War, the 7 Years' War. Okay, now the next question after that. Which 2 countries each thought that they had a claim to the Ohio River Valley? Was it the Britain and Spain? Was it France and Portugal? Was it American and Britain? Or was it France and Britain? Okay, the next question after that. Which country did the Native American tribes side with during the war? French A, B British, C both, D neither. Some people say neither. I say neither. All right, next one. The French traded blank weapons and other important goods with the Native American tribes. All right, was it beads, copper, or furs? All right, next question. We're moving right along. If I go too fast, you can always pause. What was the name of Benjamin Franklin's proposed plan to unite the colonies? Was it called the Charleston Plan, B, the Pennsylvania Plan, C, the Albany Plan, or D, the Virginia Plan? All right, the next one after that. What was the fort built by George Washington and his men in 1754 called? A, Fort Necessity, Fort Duquesne, Fort Knox, or Fort Sumter? Next question. Which country had to give up most of its land in North America after losing the French and Indian War? Was it A, Britain, B, France, or C, America? We should get getting close to the end here, somewhere. One announcement made by King George III stated that all lands west of the Appalachian Mountains belonged to the Native Americans. It made them really, really, really angry. A, the Stamp Act, B, the Treaty of Paris, C, the Sugar Act, or D, the Proclamation of 1763. Right? What act passed in 1764 was supposed to raise money for the British war debt? The Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Treaty of Paris, or the Proclamation of 1763? All right. Let's see if we have any more after that. It looks like we don't. In that last part, it says there might be a blank about in your own words, write the definition of it. You can do that for extra credit for tickets, and we're going to talk about we talked about tickets yesterday, so you can do those 3 things for tickets. If you don't want tickets, then you don't have to do them. So there you go. All right, so I hope you enjoyed our first video together. It was long. I know it was. Normally, they won't be this long. They'll be a little bit shorter than this, okay? And so make sure you follow the directions on your assignment sheet on what to do with the pages, and I'm going to see you at school.